The marble floor gleamed beneath the soft golden lights of the Grand Plaza Hotel lobby, reflecting the quiet elegance expected of one of Manhattan's most prestigious establishments. Zoe Johnson moved briskly across it with a mop and bucket, her back slightly bent, hands gloved, and her dark blue cleaning uniform creased with the weight of countless hours of labor. She kept her head down, always down. Not just because that's what Manager Richards expected, but because after 6 years of being unseen, unheard, and undervalued, she had almost come to believe she belonged in the background. But that morning, as she moved behind one of the massive columns near the entrance, her phone vibrated in her pocket. The sound, barely audible over the distant hum of conversation and clinking glassware, hit her like a bolt of lightning. Her hand trembled as she checked the screen. It was them, the university. The one she had applied to 6 times. The one that never answered. Her breath caught. She shouldn't answer. Rule number 1 from Manager Richards: no personal calls during hours. Especially not in the lobby. Especially not for the cleaning staff. Especially not for someone like her. But she did. Because something in her said this wasn't just a call, it was a turning point. "One moment," she whispered in a panic, ducking further behind the column and pressing the phone to her ear. "Zoe Johnson?" a voice asked on the line. But not in English, in perfect, fluid Dutch. Zoe's reply came without hesitation, like a reflex buried deep within her bones. "J.A., dit is Zoe Johnson," she said. Her tongue, once dulled by disuse in this life of mops and disinfectant, rediscovered its elegance, its rhythm. Her Dutch poured out like water breaking a dam, natural, precise, alive. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a revelation. She forgot the lobby. She forgot the rules. For a few brief, brilliant moments, she was back in that version of herself that once dreamed of becoming a cultural linguist, before rejections, rent, and racism told her to shrink herself. As she discussed her motivation letter, apparently lost in transit, she explained her concerns with careful grammar and deep concern. Mijn motiveringsbrief was te laat aangekomen. Ik had het twee weken geleden verzonden. Her words were not just spoken, they were felt, driven by years of effort, of silent perseverance. But when she finally paused, the air around her was not as it had been. It was heavy, still. She looked up. Standing just feet away was Richard Coleman, the billionaire owner of the hotel chain, flanked by none other than Manager Richards. Coleman's expression was unreadable, an eyebrow raised, eyes narrowed in either confusion or curiosity. Richards, however, looked as though she had just caught a thief in the act. "I have to go. Ik bel je later terug," Zoe said hurriedly, ending the call and clutching her phone like it might burn through her skin. "Johnson. In my office. Now." The command sliced through the air. As Zoe walked toward the basement office, every step echoed with humiliation. She felt the stares of her co-workers, a few sympathetic, most judgmental. At 29, she was the only black woman in the housekeeping staff with a college degree, a fact everyone conveniently forgot. The weight of 6 years of cleaning rooms with a mind built for international diplomacy bore down on her like lead. Inside the office, Richards didn't yell, she didn't need to. Her scorn was practiced, precise. "You know the rules, Johnson. No phones during working hours. Especially not, whatever that was. French. Dutch," Zoe corrected instinctively, and regretted it the second the word left her mouth. Richard's lips curled in a smirk. "I don't care if it was Martian. Mr. Coleman just saw a cleaning lady chatting away like she's at a cafe while guests walk by. Embarrassing. Embarrassing. That's what she was to them. A black woman speaking Dutch, fluently, confidently. Something about that image didn't sit right with the established order. You're assigned to the convention center bathrooms for the next 3 months. No overtime. Be thankful I'm not firing you." Zoe nodded silently. She had learned long ago that arguing was futile. Her throat tightened, not with tears, but with fury she didn't dare release. That night, in the cramped apartment she shared with 2 exhausted nurses, Zoe stared at the framed degree on her wall. Linguistics, Georgetown University, and beneath it, her certificates from international language programs. Her hands were raw from bleach. Her voice hoarse from silence. She had fought to get here. And still, she was invisible. Or so she thought. Because upstairs, in an office she'd never dared enter, a billionaire who had overheard one unexpected conversation was quietly asking for her file. And everything, was about to change. The next morning, Zoe arrived at the hotel early, her eyes hollow from a sleepless night. Her body moved on autopilot, scrubbing tile, emptying trash, polishing brass fixtures. Each task as mechanical as the silence she'd learned to survive within. But beneath that practiced exterior, something had shifted. Yesterday's call had stirred a piece of her long buried beneath polite nods and invisible labor. Then the phone at the front desk rang. Zoe Johnson, the receptionist called out, her voice tinged with confusion. HR wants to see you. Zoe froze. HR. Her first instinct was dread. Had she pushed too far? Was her punishment not enough? She wiped her hands on her apron, removed her gloves, and headed to the executive elevator, the one she was never meant to use. It felt like stepping into another world, one where voices echoed with entitlement and cologne trailed like a signature. No one acknowledged her presence. She was still invisible here. But something was different. She was being summoned. When she stepped into the HR office, a man she had never met looked up from a file. Zoe Johnson, he asked. Please have a seat. Her stomach twisted. She sat, upright and braced for termination. Instead, he said, Mr. Coleman would like to meet with you. She blinked. Mr. Coleman, the owner. Yes. Now, please. The walk to his office was surreal. The doors were heavy oak. The carpet swallowed her footsteps. When she entered, Richard Coleman was already reviewing something at his desk, a man who, until yesterday, had passed her without a glance. Today, he looked up and met her eyes with calm intensity. Dutch. French. Italian. Mandarin, he said without preamble, glancing at the file. Correct. Zoe's lips parted. Yes, how did you? I asked HR for your resume after I heard you speak yesterday. Honors degree from Georgetown. International certificates. 6 languages. And cleaning rooms in my hotel for 6 years. Zoe opened her mouth but couldn't find her voice. No one had ever looked at her like this, like she existed. He leaned back in his chair. Why? It was a simple question. But it carried 6 years of silence, rejection, closed doors, and quiet, buried humiliation. Zoe looked down. I applied. 47 times. Sent resumes to the International Relations Department. I tried 12 internal transfer requests. And always denied. By Manager Richards and Director Whitmore. Coleman didn't flinch, but he wrote their names in his notepad. Interesting, he murmured. Whitmore constantly complains about the lack of multilingual staff for our international clients. His tone sharpened as if he was connecting dots in real time, but his face remained unreadable. What he didn't tell Zoe was that her situation wasn't a one-off oversight. He had been suspecting something deeper, systemic, within his East Coast operations for months. Turnover was unusually high among highly qualified non-white employees. Morale was low. Productivity even lower. Zoe had just confirmed what no audit could fully prove. It wasn't incompetence. It was gatekeeping. Tomorrow, he said, standing suddenly, we're hosting a high-level trade conference, delegates from the Netherlands and China. I need someone who speaks both Dutch and Mandarin. Fluently. With cultural nuance. She blinked. You want me to clean their rooms? He chuckled, only slightly. No. I want you to be our international relations coordinator for the event. Temporarily. Salary, $5,000 a week. The words hung in the air. Zoe's fingers curled around the strap of her old bag. $5,000 a week. It was more than she made in 3 months. Why me? She asked, barely above a whisper. There are hundreds more. Because I heard you. And I read your file. And because I suspect there's something very wrong going on in my company. Zoe swallowed. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Part of her wanted to laugh, nervously, disbelievingly. But another part, the part that had waited 6 years for someone to finally see her, simply nodded. An hour later, she stepped into the elevator again, but not as a cleaner. This time, she wore a guest services badge with full access. As the elevator rose, she rehearsed everything she'd learned over the years, not just the languages and grammar, but how to survive with dignity when your dignity was constantly questioned. And as the doors opened to the executive floor, she came face to face with Manager Richards. The older woman's face twisted in disbelief. "Johnson, what are you doing up here? Where's your uniform?" Zoe met her eyes without blinking. "Working, Ms. Richards. I've been appointed temporary international relations coordinator, at the direct request of Mr. Coleman." The color drained from Richard's face. That's impossible. You don't have the qualifications." "Georgetown. 6 languages, including Mandarin and Dutch. My resume has been in the hotel's files for 6 years, along with all 12 transfer requests." Richard stammered. Zoe didn't stop to listen. As she walked past, the sound of her footsteps echoed not with apology, but arrival, quiet, overdue, but undeniable. The halls that once absorbed her presence now bore witness to something different, the re-emergence of a woman who had never stopped being extraordinary, only hidden. And the system that had worked so hard to keep her invisible was, for the first time, being forced to look her in the eye. Zoe sat alone in the VIP lounge, a folder of conference materials open before her, her eyes scanning the Mandarin translations line by line. The polished elegance of the room, velvet seating, golden trim, minimalist art, should have intimidated her. It didn't. What disturbed her wasn't the grandeur. It was the quiet violence of incompetence wrapped in a ribbon of authority. The translated documents were full of errors, not just grammatical, but cultural. Subtle phrases that might seem innocuous in English became borderline offensive in formal business Mandarin. She could already imagine the cold glances, the confusion, the silent breakdown of trust. And these weren't just words. They were bridges between cultures, between millions of dollars in partnership, and this bridge had been built with ignorance. Whoever had done this had no real grasp of the language's nuance. Someone had pretended to know Mandarin, and had been paid like an expert. A bitter wave of disbelief rolled through her chest, but she pressed it down. She made the corrections silently, carefully, methodically. Each pen stroke was a reclamation, not just of accuracy, but of worth. Behind her, footsteps sounded at the doorway. She didn't turn until she felt the stillness, the gaze. "How did you know they were wrong?" asked Richard Coleman. She looked up, startled, but not shaken. "Because I understand the language. Not just the grammar. The culture." She paused, then added, "Whoever did this, they don't." Coleman stepped into the room slowly, watching her work. "Whitmore assured me he hired the best." Zoe didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slid the original documents across the table, highlighting the errors. One misused term translated to something akin to dishonor in corporate Mandarin, a tone-deaf mistake that could unravel negotiations before they began. "He hired someone without checking their credentials," Zoe said quietly, her voice tight with restraint. "And it shows." That night, in her new room on the 18th floor, no longer the shared apartment with peeling walls and the constant hum of other people's exhaustion, Zoe stared at the city skyline, a pen in her hand and a growing storm in her mind. She wasn't just here to prove herself anymore. She was here to pull back the curtain, to show them what they had been blind to, or refused to see. The next morning, the conference began. Zoe moved between tables, executives, and translators like she had been born into it. Her posture was calm, fluid. Her transitions between Dutch and Mandarin were effortless. She didn't just speak the languages, she carried herself like someone who belonged in this world, because she did. It was the world that had shut the door, not her that had failed to open it. But then came Whitmore. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. Not once. And now, suddenly, there he was, smiling without warmth, shaking her hand like it was a photo op. "Miss Johnson," he said through a practiced grin. "Impressive work." She nodded politely. "Thank you. I just reviewed the updated translations. Very thorough. Clearly, Richards misjudged your potential." The smile froze when she responded evenly. Yes, it's impressive how my resume, clearly listing Mandarin fluency, was somehow overlooked. Especially since the hotel just spent $50,000 on translations that nearly caused an international incident. Whitmore stiffened. There was a flicker of panic behind his eyes, quickly replaced by denial. There must be some misunderstanding. I received confirmation of receipt for every email, she said, including the ones pointing out critical translation errors. What Zoe didn't say, yet, was that she had access to the records now. The name on those expensive translation contracts. Ashley Whitmore. His niece. No proven experience. No real credentials. Just a connection. And a lie. A very expensive, dangerously unqualified lie. Zoe had seen enough to know this wasn't just a fluke. This was a pattern. Deliberate, sustained exclusion. And it had cost more than money. It had cost lives, careers, dignity. Later, in Coleman's office, she presented the full file. Evidence. Screenshots. Email confirmations. Invoices 3 times the market rate. A paper trail of nepotism and fraud. Coleman read in silence. Then Zoe from HR burst in with a folder of her own, 5 years of hiring patterns. Rejections. Mostly women. Mostly black. Mostly overqualified. Coleman's face darkened. This isn't a pattern, he said, voice low and hard. This is a system. And when Whitmore entered, arrogant, interrupting, oblivious, Coleman didn't wait for an explanation. He delivered the verdict calmly, like a surgeon identifying the tumor before the incision. Your niece's certification. Fake, Zoe said, sliding the proof across the desk. Peking University has never heard of her. Whitmore's face twisted. You're nobody. A cleaning lady playing pretend. PhD in Applied Linguistics. Georgetown. 6 international publications, Zoe replied, her voice steady. You've been losing to me for 6 years. You just didn't know it. That night, back in her room, Zoe opened her drawer and pulled out the small black device that had sat silently in her blazer pocket. Every veiled threat, every slur Whitmore had whispered in the halls, every attempt to silence her had been recorded. She had the truth. All of it. But healing wasn't just about revenge. It was about breathing without fear. About waking up and remembering that your value doesn't depend on someone else's recognition. As she stared at the night sky, Zoe felt something unfurl in her chest, not rage, not vindication, but clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone like her. Everyone who had talent buried under uniforms. Voices crushed under silence. She was no longer the woman hiding behind a column with a phone. She was the voice echoing through the highest office in the building, and they were finally listening. Morning broke with a softness Zoe hadn't felt in years. The sun filtered through the tall windows of the Grand Plaza's executive floor, bathing the corridors in gold. But inside the hotel's grand auditorium, the atmosphere was taut, electrified, not with luxury, but with anticipation. News had spread. Managers summoned. Executives recalled from their meetings. Staff from every department packed into rows of plush chairs, many unsure of why they had been called at all. At the front, Zoe stood beside Richard Coleman, her fingers loosely clasped before her, a calmness in her breath that came not from certainty, but from knowing she had nothing left to lose. Behind them, a screen flickered to life with slides she had spent the night preparing. Graphs, names, patterns that had remained buried for years. Today, they would be unearthed. Coleman's voice broke the silence. Not loud, but firm. Today, he began, we confront something far more dangerous than economic loss. We confront the cost of wasted potential. He gestured to the screen. Side-by-side comparisons showed employees with high-level qualifications assigned to housekeeping, maintenance, and laundry, most of them women of color. Next, inflated contracts. Misallocated promotions. A hiring and rejection chart that revealed the quiet machinery of discrimination working beneath a polished surface. There were gasps. Murmurs. A ripple of realization. Beside him, Zoe remained still. Then her name appeared on the screen. A single line. Dr. Zoe Johnson, Georgetown University. Linguist. 6 languages. 6 years in housekeeping. 12 denied transfer requests. 47 unanswered internal applications. The room fell silent again. And slowly, the weight of it all sank in, not just the statistics, but the story. The reality of what they had ignored. Or enabled. Had she not answered a call in Dutch, Coleman said softly, this room would still be blind to her. Some clapped. Others lowered their heads. Coleman turned to Zoe. It's my honor to announce that Dr. Zoe Johnson is our new Global Director of Internal Communications, overseeing multilingual operations across all Grand Plaza properties worldwide. This time, the applause rose like a tide. Hesitant at first. Then unstoppable. Especially from the cleaning staff, who sat at the back, some crying, some rising to their feet. For them, it wasn't just a promotion. It was permission to believe again. But the miracle didn't end there. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Zoe, now dressed not in a uniform but in tailored blazers, began quietly rebuilding the company from the inside. She launched an initiative called Invisible Talents, a program designed to find and uplift overlooked employees. Her team pored over files, cross-referenced resumes with current positions, and within weeks uncovered over 100 workers, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in finance, certified in IT, trapped in underpaid roles. And the numbers told their own story. International client satisfaction rose by 42%, translation costs dropped by over 70%, and the hotel's internal diversity metrics surged. But it wasn't the metrics that healed something in Zoe, it was the faces. There was Jamila, the night janitor with a degree in data analytics, now overseeing the tech operations of 3 properties. Marcus, the bellhop who spoke 4 African dialects and became the company's new liaison for its expansion into West Africa. Every success felt like a thread pulling tightly wound injustice apart. Then one evening, Zoe passed through the same lobby where it had all started. She paused at the base of the grand staircase, letting her hand trace the marble. This time, she wasn't cleaning it. She wasn't hiding behind it. She was remembering, not out of bitterness, but reverence for the version of herself who had endured it all. Across the room, Sarah Richards sat at a desk she no longer commanded, demoted, quiet, her presence a hollow echo of the control she once wielded. When she looked up and met Zoe's gaze, there was no anger, only shame. But Zoe didn't linger. She had no interest in revenge. Her justice had always been transformation. And that transformation deepened when she received a letter in her office. A crisp white envelope bearing a Dutch seal. Inside, a letter from the University of Applied Linguistics in Amsterdam. Professor Van Tun, the very man who had called her that day, offered her a position as a visiting professor, citing her groundbreaking work in corporate linguistics and workplace inclusion. Zoe stared at the signature for a long time, her heart swelling with something deeper than pride, healing. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the quiet, steady restoration of a woman who had spent years convincing herself she wasn't allowed to want more. As the city glittered beneath her office window that night, she whispered aloud, if she had only scolded me, I might still be scrubbing floors. Because the miracle wasn't the title or the salary or the applause. The miracle was that, finally, someone had seen her. And because of that, others would be seen too. The first time Zoe saw Leia, she was bent over a linen cart in the west wing of the hotel, her movements quick and silent, like someone used to being invisible. Leia was small, maybe in her early 20s, with tightly braided hair and a quiet strength in her posture. Her eyes, though, betrayed something deeper. Exhaustion, yes, but also a kind of cautious hope. Zoe recognized it instantly. She had worn that look for years. It had been 6 months since the boardroom exploded in applause, since contracts changed hands and old powers were dismantled. But in the quieter hallways of the Grand Plaza, the world moved more slowly. Not everyone had caught up to the new reality. And for many like Leia, the scars of silence hadn't healed yet, they had simply been folded into the rhythm of survival. That day, Leia had spoken barely 3 words when Zoe approached her. Yes, before turning quickly away. But Zoe noticed the small worn notebook sticking out of her apron pocket. She waited until the hallway cleared before gently asking, "What do you write?" Leia hesitated. Just notes. Can I see? The girl's cheeks flushed. She handed Zoe the notebook, eyes cast down. Inside were sentences written in perfect French, paragraphs in Spanish, and quotes in Swahili. On the last page was a draft, handwritten, carefully composed, of a scholarship application. It ended with the line, "My dream is to manage a hotel like this one day, not just clean it." Zoe looked up slowly. "Do you speak all these?" Leia nodded, embarrassed. "My father was a diplomat. We moved a lot. But after he died, we lost everything. My mom got sick. I stayed here. Took this job because it paid weekly." Zoe's throat tightened. Not out of pity, but recognition. She reached into her bag, pulled out a business card, and handed it to Leia. "Come see me tomorrow morning," she said. "Don't wear the uniform." Leia showed up early. She wore her only blazer, borrowed from a cousin, and clutched a manila envelope full of documents. Zoe sat with her in the same HR office where her own story had shifted. She reviewed the transcripts, the certificates, the letters of recommendation, all real, all untouched, buried under hours of silent labor and mopped floors. Within 2 weeks, Leia was enrolled in the Invisible Talents Mentorship Program, paired with Zoe directly. She started in guest services, shadowing international clients, translating at events, coordinating logistics. Her first week was hard. She didn't smile much. She was polite to everyone, but distant. Still waiting for the moment when it would all be taken away, like it always had before. But Zoe watched her grow. She watched the way Leia stayed late to organize documents no one had asked her to. How she caught translation errors before they reached the clients. How she once corrected a regional manager, gently and respectfully, in a strategy meeting, and how everyone in the room finally started to look at her, not just around her. Then came the conference in Brazil. Zoe had been scheduled to attend, but a last-minute health scare with her mother kept her in New York. "You'll go in my place," she told Leia. Leia's face went pale. "Me? You speak Portuguese. You know the material. And more importantly, you care about what you're saying." The flight was overnight. Leia sat in the front row of the plane, stunned by the legroom, fingers twitching nervously over her lap. She practiced her opening lines again and again, but when the moment came, standing on that stage, looking out over a crowd of international hoteliers, she didn't stutter once. Her voice was low, but clear. She spoke about opportunity, about systems, about the quiet resilience of those who are always underestimated, about what happens when the right person finally gets seen. The applause was long and loud. But even louder was the silence that followed, when the crowd sat with the weight of her words and the shame of their own blind spots. When Leia returned, Zoe met her at the airport. "You were brilliant," she said, hugging her. "I was scared the whole time," Leia whispered. Zoe smiled. "So was I. That means you were doing something real." Months passed. Leia was offered a full scholarship, this time funded by the Coleman Foundation. She enrolled in hotel management, part-time while continuing to work. Her name started appearing in internal memos, tagged in recommendations. Clients began requesting her personally. At the end-of-year conference, it was Leia who introduced Zoe on stage. "She didn't just change the policy," she said through the microphone, her voice steady. "She changed the storyline." That night, as Zoe walked through the hotel lobby once more, she noticed something had shifted, not in the chandeliers or marble floors, but in the air itself. Staff laughed more. Names were remembered. Languages were spoken freely. She passed a housekeeping cart. A young man paused, nodded at her, and smiled, not with fear, but familiarity. She smiled back. Because Leia wasn't the exception. She was the beginning of 100 hidden stories finally being told. And Zoe had simply opened the door. Tyler hadn't spoken to Zoe much before the investigation, mostly nods in the hallway or a quiet good morning when he passed her in the break room. He was a mid-level supervisor in facilities maintenance, early 40s, white, clean-cut, and always on time. He never raised his voice. Never rocked the boat. He called himself a company man. But after the board meeting, The board meeting, something shifted in his eyes. Like something had cracked. Not broken, just finally let in the light. He saw her one afternoon, outside the HR office. She had just come out of a meeting with the mentorship team and looked exhausted. But before she could pass, Tyler cleared his throat. "I should have said something," he began. "Back then. About how they treated you." Zoe paused. "You didn't know." "I did," he admitted. "I just didn't let myself see it too clearly. Thought if I didn't cause trouble, I was doing my job right." She didn't answer, but something softened in her face. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. Over the following weeks, Tyler became a constant, quiet presence in the restructuring efforts. He asked to be transferred to the Invisible Talents program as a logistics coordinator, overseeing building access for new trainees. But it wasn't just paperwork. Tyler personally walked new recruits through orientation, sat in on translation evaluations, brought extra chairs to meetings when he noticed someone standing in the back. And he listened, really listened, for the first time in his career. The turning point came when he stood up in a staff meeting and said, "For 20 years I thought my job was fixing what was broken. Turns out, the pipes were fine. It was the system that was rusting from the inside." Zoe smiled quietly from across the room. Tyler didn't need applause. He just needed to start over. And he had. Then there was Franklin. Franklin had been one of Whitmore's closest allies. Head of accounting. Quiet. Distant. Always speaking in numbers. Never in names. He was the kind of man who hid behind spreadsheets and budgets, whose corner office overlooked the city but rarely noticed the people in the building below. He had signed off on the inflated translation contracts. He had stamped every budget-neutral denial of internal transfers. When the truth came out, Franklin had nearly resigned. He avoided Zoe for weeks. But one morning, he walked into her office unannounced. No assistant, no prepared speech, just a thin folder and a pale face. "I want to show you something," he said. Inside the folder was a report, his own audit. One he had started privately after the investigation. It showed a clear trail of misallocated funds, unreviewed promotions, and hidden overtime abuses across multiple departments. He had named names, including his own. "I knew what was happening," he admitted, voice shaking. "Not all of it. But enough. I kept the machine running because it was easier than asking why it was built that way." Zoe leaned back, arms crossed, watching him. "Why are you bringing this to me now?" "Because I can't fix the past," he said. "But I can stop being part of the future I don't believe in." It wasn't an apology. It was a reckoning. Zoe handed the folder back to him. "You'll present it. To the board." His face paled. "They'll tear me apart." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe they'll finally see the kind of courage that should have been in your reports all along." And he did. In a meeting that left the room stunned, Franklin confessed his role, not as a villain, but as a man who had been complicit by convenience. He didn't deflect. Didn't excuse. Just told the truth. Afterward, Coleman offered him a choice: step down quietly, or stay, and lead a new transparency task force, reporting directly to Zoe. Franklin chose to stay. He moved out of his corner office, gave up his private parking space, and asked to share a cubicle space with the new internal audit team, half of whom had once worked in housekeeping. Over time, he and Zoe developed a strange but steady rapport. Not friendship, perhaps, but mutual respect. They met weekly. He listened more than he spoke. And when Zoe proposed a profit-sharing plan for underrepresented employees who contributed to systemic improvements, Franklin was the first to find the loopholes and close them himself. One night, as they were reviewing end-of-quarter numbers, he looked up from the spreadsheet and said quietly, "My daughter's in college now. She asked me last week what kind of man I used to be." Zoe didn't reply. "She said she didn't want the answer," he continued. "She just wanted me to keep becoming someone better." For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Zoe said, "She's right. We don't need to erase who we were. We just need to make sure we're no longer protecting that version of ourselves." By the end of the year, Both Tyler and Franklin stood beside her on stage at the annual Diversity and Integrity Summit, flanking her like shadows who had chosen to become light. Tyler gave the welcome address. Franklin presented the new internal justice protocols. And Zoe closed the evening with a single sentence that left the room breathless. Redemption isn't found in the applause. It's found in the quiet, consistent work of repairing what you once helped break. And when they walked offstage, the three of them, once strangers divided by position and power, walked together. Not as symbols, but as proof that people can change. If they choose to see. If they choose to stay. It had been nearly a year since the conference in Brazil. Since Leia stood under the bright lights, speaking softly but unshakably about second chances and unseen brilliance. In the months that followed, her name had become synonymous with the next wave of the Invisible Talents program. She was interviewed for journals, invited to panels, even featured in a short documentary about rising stars in hospitality. But as the spotlight grew, Leia seemed to retreat from it, not out of fear, but out of something quieter and more difficult to name. Zoe noticed the shift first during their weekly check-ins. Leia had always been thoughtful, careful with her words. But now her answers were clipped. Her smile, more practiced. She started rescheduling meetings. Then skipping them altogether. She stopped replying to emails on weekends, a healthy boundary, Zoe told herself. But something didn't feel like balance. It felt like distance. The last message Zoe received from her was a thank you card left on her desk. Inside. You changed my life. Now I need to figure out how to live it. Please don't worry, I'm just learning how to breathe again. No return address. No explanation. She was gone. Weeks passed. Then months. Zoe kept the card in her drawer, unopened but never untouched. It became something between a scar and a seed, a small, quiet weight reminding her that not all growth is visible. And not every story ends in the same room where it began. Still, there were moments when she couldn't help but wonder, had Leia been overwhelmed? Burned out by the sudden shift from invisibility to influence? Had Zoe pushed too hard, too fast? Or worse, had the system, even after all the changes, still found a way to devour someone like her? Then one chilly afternoon in November, Zoe attended a language accessibility summit in Philadelphia. She wasn't scheduled to speak, just observe, learn, connect. She sat in the back of a modest conference room, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup, watching a panel discussion on emerging voices in multilingual design. And then she heard it. A voice. Steady. Measured. Layered with experience. Because designing for language isn't just about words. It's about dignity. It's about making sure someone doesn't need to explain who they are before they're allowed to be heard. Zoe turned, heart stuttering. There, on stage, sat Leia. Her hair was shorter now, natural curls framing her face. She wore no blazer, no name tag with credentials, just a simple brown sweater, soft jeans, and a microphone in her hand. She looked lighter, still composed, but different, more whole. She didn't mention the Grand Plaza, or Zoe, or even her role in the Invisible Talents initiative. She spoke like a woman who had built her own language from scratch and had finally made peace with its grammar. After the panel, Zoe waited outside the exit doors, unsure of what she would say, or if she should say anything at all. Leia walked past at first. But then she stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes landing on Zoe. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Leia stepped forward and hugged her, not out of obligation, but with the unguarded warmth of someone who no longer needed to defend their worth. "I thought I'd lost you," Zoe whispered. "You didn't," Leia said. "I just needed to lose the version of myself who thought she had to be everything, all at once." They walked to a nearby bench and sat for a while, watching the late autumn sun bleed into the skyline. Zoe didn't ask where Leia had been. Leia didn't explain. Instead, they spoke about language, how it could free or bind. About systems. About silence. About grief. Zoe shared that her mother had passed 2 months earlier. "I couldn't find the right words for the eulogy," she said. "Which is ironic, I guess." Leia nodded. "Sometimes the truest things don't have names." Before they parted, Zoe reached into her bag and handed Leia a small notebook. Inside were blank pages, except the first one. She had written, "This isn't a chapter. It's a space. Fill it when you're ready." Leia smiled, eyes glassy but bright. "I will," she said. "But this time, the story's mine to tell." Zoe watched her walk away into the crowd, disappearing not into obscurity, but into choice. She didn't know when she'd see her again. But she knew this much: Leia wasn't lost. She was becoming. And this, too, was part of the work, not saving people, not lifting them up like trophies or testaments, but stepping aside when the time came. Making room. Holding space. And trusting that sometimes the greatest impact you can have is letting someone find their way back to themselves. The hotel lobby looked different now. The chandeliers still hung like constellations, and the marble floors still echoed with the sounds of footsteps, luggage wheels, and distant conversations. But something intangible had shifted, like the walls themselves had begun to breathe a little deeper, as though every corner had finally been seen. Zoe stood near the large glass windows that framed the skyline. It was dusk. The kind of light that blurs the edges of the city and makes even the sharpest buildings look soft. Behind her, voices filled the ballroom where the final gathering of the Invisible Talents Initiative was underway. Employees from across the country had flown in. Housekeepers, line cooks, receptionists, maintenance workers, translators, data clerks, many of whom now bore titles like project lead, cultural liaison, systems analyst. They wore their old uniforms to the gala by choice, not necessity. They wanted to remind the world where they'd come from, and how far they'd risen. Zoe didn't go on stage this time. She had declined the keynote. "They don't need to hear from me anymore," she had said. "Let them tell their own stories now." Still, she lingered by the doors, listening. Leia was presenting tonight, walking the crowd through the first rollout of the new Language Equity Fund. Tyler had just introduced the newest cohort of mentorship fellows, among them a former dishwasher now managing procurement in Miami. And Franklin had spoken briefly, emotionally, about how he was retiring next spring, not out of guilt, but out of peace. "I've made amends. Now it's time to make room." Someone approached Zoe quietly. Jennifer, the receptionist who once called her to HR that life-changing morning, smiled and handed her an envelope. "You might want to read this alone," she said before disappearing into the crowd. Zoe stepped outside, into the quiet. The night air was cool. She sat on a bench beneath the same ivy-wrapped trellis where she had once eaten lunch alone for years, her linguistics degree folded deep in her coat pocket, afraid of being seen. She opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. At the top, embossed in gold, were the words Georgetown University, Department of Applied Linguistics. And beneath that, "We are pleased to welcome Dr. Zoe Johnson as our visiting lecturer for the 2026 academic year. Your contribution to the field of sociolinguistics, cultural equity, and institutional change is not only timely, it is transformative. Welcome home." She held the letter in her hands for a long time. Not crying. Not laughing. Just still. So much had changed. But one truth remained. The girl who once whispered Dutch behind a marble column, scared of being overheard, had become the woman who now stood silently at the center of a revolution she never meant to lead. And somehow, that was enough. She took out her phone and opened her last saved voicemail. It was her mother's voice. Soft. Gentle. Full of the kind of wisdom that only love knows how to carry. "Don't forget, baby, even if they don't see you, you shine anyway." Zoe closed her eyes and listened, letting every syllable settle deep into the parts of her that had once believed she needed permission to exist fully. In the ballroom, music began to play. Laughter spilled into the hallway. Someone was calling her name. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the sound, not to take the stage, but to stand beside the people who had finally found their voices. There was no plaque big enough to hold what had been built. No speech strong enough to explain what had been healed. But there was presence. There was legacy. And above all, there was this simple, unshakable fact. Zoe had stayed. And because she stayed, they had risen. Not because she saved them, but because she saw them. And in seeing them, she reminded them of their worth. That night, as stars blinked above the city and the hotel glowed with new light, Zoe smiled, not with triumph, but with knowing. Because the story hadn't ended. It had only just begun.